So I want to, with that context, then I want to talk about the 1619 project. But before I do that, if I can, I meant to ask this. I don't know if you can set up a quick poll or if we can just have people, let's see, I think if I move, could you, if you have heard of or seen the 1619 project or read it, could you maybe raise your hand?
Yeah, maybe you guys can use the raise your hand button, or if you don't have access to that right now, you could just literally do this. If
Yeah,
you have heard of the 1619 project.
great. Oh, great. Almost everyone. Excellent. And how many of you have actually read it? Have you actually looked at it? And you can even unmute and say, yes, I have. Yeah, yeah, that's great. Yeah, a few of you. Excellent. That's good to know. So I want to talk a little bit about the 1619 project, which again, I see as very much aligned with the kinds of things I've been doing in my academic career, really trying to get this history, not only of slavery, but African American history before the public, trying to um, uh, encourage more and more people to ask questions about this history. And as you probably know, if you have read the 1619 Project and then read some of the controversy, I want to talk a little bit about some of the controversy and then my part in some of the controversy and then why I think there was so much controversy. So as you know, the 1619 Project, a woman named Nicole Hannah-Jones, a very well-known and well-regarded journalist in January of 2019, asked the New York Times if they would consider doing a special project commemorating the arrival of, as the primary source says, quote, 20, in their pronunciation, Negars, which is not the N word as we think of today. It's also not Negro as we think of today. When we look at primary sources in this time period, there is not a standardization of spelling. In addition, if I'm remembering correctly, that ship it's a Dutch ship. So then we also have Dutch language. This is not necessarily British language. But anyway, those 20 people of African descent, their arrival in Virginia in 1619. Now, this for a long time in the history that we were taught in our nation, including the history that I was taught, certainly in K through 12, this Virginia was particularly important, and the 1619 moment was important because Virginia, by the end of that century, in the 1680s, becomes the place in which the first slave codes are developed for the British North American colonies. So for many historians, 1619 and what's happening in Virginia are central to how we understand the United States, how we understand slavery in the US. The Virginia codes are the same codes with some variation that are used for US slavery all the way down to the Civil War. So that 1619 moment was seen as the start of many things. Now, let me say one thing, though, about the 20. The 20 arrived before the Virginia slave codes. So we're not completely sure. The 20 are not subject to slavery in the way that we most often think of it. They probably were not born into slavery. They were not considered to be lifetime slaves. And in fact, several of them became landowners and owned slaves themselves by the mid to late 17th century, just before those first slave codes were established. So we have to be careful about what we understand with those 20. They had a very different experience than would be true of most people after the 1680s, 1690s, and then into the 1700s. But their arrival, the fact that we think that they were sold, although we're not sure about that, the fact that we think some of them, if not all of them, experienced some form of enslavement and then later may have gained freedom, but that importation for many is seen as an important moment. And again, I would say it's important because it happens in Virginia. Now, I want to say also that there are other enslaved people who arrive earlier, in Florida, for example, but because the US doesn't always claim Spanish Florida as part of its ancestry, we are so focused on the British influence, we don't study that the same way. We are only now beginning to study the French influence, which happens later, but we don't think about as much the French influence. We see that our laws and our, for better or worse, and I think we're going to continue to investigate this question, but we think that everything in the US, in a way, is descended from Great Britain. But in fact, there are Spanish influences, French influences. Of course, if you go out to California, there are a set of influences that even come in from Mexico. So anyway, so that's why 1619. Oops, let me go. So the thing with the 1619 project also that I'll say that was very exciting to me is that it was looking at the impact of slavery and African Americans. So part of it was about recovering a history, but they were very upfront that part of it was about seeing what the legacies of those histories are. And I listed just a few of those. Those of you who have looked at the 1619 project, either in print or online, you know that it discusses the impact of slavery and of African Americans on equality and democracy, on capitalism, medicine, physical landscape, the ways that cities are divided up to dealing sometimes with race and segregation, health and nutrition, the article by Khalil Gibran Muhammad about sugar, American culture and music, incarceration, I could go on and on.